What's your rank, you loser? Oh, right. Trash doesn't have a rank. Captain Roger Castillo. My brother-in-law's roar slammed into face in the middle of the packed Fort Bradley Gala. He snatched a champagne flute from a passing silver tray and shoved it violently into my hands, the cold liquor sloshing over the rim and soaking straight through my cheap gray suit. Your rank is servant. Serve. My biological sister Melissa stepped up beside him, her painted lips twisted in pure disgust. Get out before you pollute our high-class atmosphere. Laughter erupted from the surrounding circle of officers, sharp and cruel, cutting through the classical music. I did not cry. I held the dripping glass with both hands for exactly 5 seconds, the champagne burning cold through the thin fabric against my skin. Then I calmly reached into my pocket and pulled out a worn leather-bound notebook. I looked straight into Roger's bloodshot eyes and began to write. He puffed out his chest and launched into a smug 15-second countdown to call security to drag me out, completely unaware that the exact second he screamed the number 1. Those massive auditorium doors would shatter open, and 4 of the most powerful brigadier generals in the United States Army would march straight toward this loser with a terrifying ironclad salute. Before continuing, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel, but only if you really want to know the ending of this story. And let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there. The freezing sting of that champagne soaking through my sleeve acted like a violent, involuntary time machine. It dragged my mind backward, 25 years straight into the kitchen of the house, where I grew up, a cramped room that always smelled faintly of roasted garlic and impending dread. I was 15 years old, sitting at the very edge of the dining table, pressing my elbows tight against my ribs, trying to take up as little space as humanly possible. My mother had set the table for 4, but my placemat was the only one without a cloth napkin. Mine was paper torn from a roll above the sink. My sister sat across from me in the seat closest to my mother. Her posture relaxed, her chin tilted upward with the casual ownership of a child who had never once been denied anything in her life. Without warning, she reached across the table and knocked a heavy glass pitcher of ice water directly into my lap. The freezing liquid exploded through the thin fabric of my only decent shirt, the sudden shock stealing the breath clean out of my lungs. My spine locked. My fingers clawed at the edge of the table. But the real cold did not come from the water. My mother rushed across the kitchen with a warm, fluffy towel and wrapped it protectively around my sister's perfectly dry shoulders, as if she were the victim who needed comforting. My father sat at the head of the table, chewing slowly, his jaw grinding in that mechanical rhythm I had memorized over 15 years of silence. Snorts. He did not look up from his plate. He said nothing, not a single word. My mother turned her furious gaze on me and scolded me for being clumsy. Blaming my presence at the table for ruining the family dinner, she turned her furious gaze on me. "Look at what you've done, you clumsy fool," she snapped, blaming my very presence for the ruined dinner. "Take your plate and eat in your room if you can't sit properly like a civilized person." I sat shivering in my wet, clinging clothes, biting the inside of my cheek until I tasted the sharp tang of copper on my tongue. I did not cry. That was the exact moment I understood the foundational truth of my family. In a house built on toxic favoritism, the victim is always penalized and the abuser is always comforted. My aunt had visited the week before, looked me up and down in my thrift store jeans and my faded secondhand sneakers, and muttered to my mother loud enough for me to hear, "She looks exactly like the janitorial staff." Nobody corrected her. My mother actually laughed, a short, dismissive exhale through her nose. The words burrowed under my skin and built a nest there, a permanent scar disguised as a casual family observation. The psychological warfare escalated relentlessly as we entered adulthood, refining itself into a systematic erasure of my existence. When I received my college acceptance letter with a full academic scholarship, my hands practically vibrated with pride as I tore open the thick envelope in the school parking lot. I had fought for that letter in absolute isolation, studying past midnight under a bare bulb, in a cramped room I shared with stacked boxes of my sister's old pageant dresses and tarnished trophies. I drove home and placed the crisp embossed envelope right in the center of the kitchen counter, the university seal facing upward, silently begging for a single crumb of parental recognition. I sat at the table and waited. Less than 10 minutes later, my sister sauntered into the room, her heavy floral perfume suffocating the air before she even rounded the corner. She did not glance at my letter. She casually tossed a glossy 5L bridal magazine directly on top of it, completely burying the envelope from view. She slammed her left hand down on the counter, a massive diamond catching the light. "I'm engaged," she announced. "Roger Castillo proposed. He's a rising first lieutenant, and we're getting married in the spring." My father leapt from his chair. He popped a bottle of sparkling cider, his loud booming cheers echoing off the kitchen walls, the foam spilling across the counter and soaking into the edge of my hidden scholarship envelope. My mother clapped her hands and immediately began calling relatives to spread the news. Nobody asked me why I was smiling when I walked through the door. Nobody asked about the envelope. It stayed buried under that bridal magazine for 3 full days. When I finally retrieved it, the embossed university seal was stained with a dark coffee ring and warped from the cider spill. They did not just overlook my achievement. They actively erased my existence to make room for her superficial borrowed triumph. I learned that day that my bloodline would never be a source of strength. It was a parasite, and it had been draining my dignity since the day I was born. I packed my standard issue canvas duffel bag in the dead of a Tuesday night 3 weeks after graduation, moving with the silent precision of a ghost. The heavy canvas scraped softly against the wooden floorboards, the only sound in a house that had never truly felt like a home. I folded 3 shirts, 2 pairs of jeans, a toothbrush, and the coffee-stained scholarship letter into the bag. I took nothing from the shared family spaces, no photographs, snowsakes. I left no sentimental note on the fridge. I did not knock on my parents' bedroom door. I did not tell my sister. Standing on the porch in the freezing, pitch-black pre-dawn air, I looked back one final time at the dark, silent house. Every window was shut, every light was off. The porch light had burned out weeks ago, and nobody had replaced it because nobody in that house ever expected me to come or go through the front door. I pulled the zipper on my duffel closed to the metal teeth, catching briefly on a loose thread before sealing shut. Expecting love from a broken toxic source was a fatal tactical error. A mistake I swore on that dark porch I would never make again. The military recruitment center was 3 miles away, down a cracked highway lined with dead streetlights. I locked the front door behind me, intentionally leaving my victimhood on the welcome mat, and walked every single step in the dark without looking back. From that morning forward, I systematically severed my real life from my family's grasping parasitic hands. I became a phantom in their world, a controlled fiction designed to keep them complacent. I answered their rare, obligatory holiday phone calls, only to feed them the narrative they desperately craved, that I was a struggling low-income office clerk, barely making rent in a miserable 1-bedroom apartment. I described a life of fluorescent-lit cubicles and instant ramen, a woman crushed by the machinery of the world, exactly the broken creature they needed me to be. My sister needed my failure to validate her success. I handed her that illusion on a silver platter, and she devoured it with the greed of someone who had never earned a single thing on her own merit. Meanwhile, in a world they could not see and would never understand, I was shattering records in officer training. I scored highest in marksmanship, tactical strategy, and psychological resilience evaluations among every candidate in my class, outperforming recruits who had spent their entire lives preparing for the military. Standing in front of this barracks mirror, one evening alone in the empty bay after lights out, I adjusted the sharp, stiff collar of my first dress uniform, the rigid fabric pressed against my collarbone like a second skin. I traced my fingers slowly over the insignia pinned to my chest, the cool metal pressing back against my fingertips, with the weight of something permanent, something no one could take from me, with a spilled picture of ice water or a bridal magazine. I made a silent, unbreakable vow to the woman in that mirror. My family would never see the armor I wore underneath, and they would never again have the power to draw my blood. I hit the basic training grounds with a burning silent desperation that genuinely unnerved my drill sergeants. Sergeant First Class Harmon pulled me aside during the second week, his face inches from mine. "Why don't you flinch, recruit? Are you made of stone?" I locked my eyes straight ahead. "I've been screamed at by experts since I was 5 years old, drill sergeant. Your volume is nothing but a whisper to me." He stared at me for a long moment, then nodded once, and never asked again. While other recruits cried for their mothers, when the pressure crushed down on their shoulders, I leaned straight into the agony. Every time my leg muscles screamed for mercy, under the weight of a 70-pound ruck during a midnight march, I closed my eyes and channeled the vivid memory of my father, popping that cider bottle while my scholarship letter lay buried and soaking under a bridal magazine. That memory was gasoline. I poured it directly onto the fire in my chest and burned it as fuel. I dragged my exhausted body through freezing mud pits in pitch darkness, gripping my service rifle until my knuckles cracked and bled. The metallic taste of adrenaline and raw blood coating my tongue. Every drop of sweat was a down payment on independence, forging a mind that simply refused to shatter. The physical pain of boot camp, the instructors spraying spit into my face at 4 a.m, the relentless grinding exhaustion that broke lesser soldiers down to sobbing shells. All of it was a welcomed, purifying luxury compared to the gaslighting, psychological warfare of my childhood home. I graduated at the top of my class. Not a single member of my family knew it happened. Not a single member of my family asked. I quickly traded the infantry mud for the sterile, high-stakes environment of military intelligence and the Inspector General's elite office. Wars here were not fought with rifles. They were fought in absolute silence, inside windowless rooms with blinding fluorescent lights and mountains of classified data. My first real test arrived 6 months into the posting. A decorated colonel, with 30 years of service, tried to bury a falsified supply audit on my desk, betting that the quiet new officer would rubber stamp the discrepancy and move on to the next file. I stayed inside my bunker for 72 consecutive hours, surviving on black coffee and protein bars, cross-referencing every single line item against the original procurement database until I found it a $300 Zuzo's ghost shipment to a warehouse that did not exist in any federal registry. I filled the report. The colonel was stripped of his supply authority within a week and transferred to a dead-end administrative post. Nobody congratulated me. Nobody needed to. I developed a permanent ingrained habit of sitting with my back against solid walls in every room I entered my eyes, constantly mapping exits, cataloging threats, reading the body language of every person within striking distance. This was not paranoia. It was a military survival instinct that permanently bled into every aspect of my civilian existence. I sacrificed personal relationships, vacations, and any version of a normal life. I earned my stars through sleepless, obsessive dedication, climbing the rigid military hierarchy in terrifying silence, becoming a phantom weapon the Department of Defense deployed when institutions needed to be gutted and rebuilt from the inside out. During the mandatory holiday visits back to my hometown, I absorbed my family's insults with the clinical detachment of an intelligence officer processing hostile interrogation noise. I intentionally wore faded clearance rack sweaters and scuffed shoes from discount bins, quietly sipping cheap tap water, while my sister aggressively flaunted her newly purchased designer bags and diamond rings directly in my face, holding them up to the light like religious artifacts. I sat on the worn floral sofa with my hands folded, listening in disciplined silence as my brother-in-law, Roger, bragged loudly about his military connections and his fast-tracked promotions, his chest puffed out like a peacock, demanding worship from every person in the room. He described himself as a rising star, a man destined for colonel within 5 years. He never mentioned the soldiers under his command. He never spoke a single word about service duty or sacrifice. I heard every lie. I cataloged every exaggeration. "Do you need a loan for groceries on that pathetic clerk salary of yours?" My sister sneered, holding her new designer bag up to the light. I merely nodded, keeping my face perfectly blank. "Thank you for the generous offer, Melissa." I treated my own bloodline exactly like hostile targets under active surveillance. methodically collecting data on their boundless arrogance while projecting absolute weakness to keep their guards firmly lowered. They looked at me and saw a broken woman nursing a glass of tap water, a pathetic low-income clerk. That was the role I wrote for myself, and they performed their parts perfectly, never once suspecting the woman on their couch, outranked everyone they had ever met. The tipping point arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning inside the heavily fortified walls of the Pentagon. I sat at my mahogany desk on the 4th floor, using a thin blade to break the red wax seal on a highly classified internal audit flagged for the Inspector General's immediate review. The cover sheet read, Fort Bradley Comprehensive Financial and Conduct Audit, Priority 1. The forensic numbers spread across the pages did not lie. Widespread embezzlement of military supply funds totaling over $2 million across 3 fiscal years. Severe systematic suppression of sexual harassment and abuse complaints filed by lower enlisted soldiers. A brutally toxic command structure that operated like a private criminal enterprise rather than a United States military installation. The audit trail led directly to the base commander, Colonel Richard Sterling, a polished, silver-haired political operator who had built his career on Washington connections and calculated intimidation. But it was the name of his most favorite enforcer, his loyal rabbit attack dog, that made my blood run ice cold, Captain Roger Castillo. My brother-in-law's name was printed in bold type on the personnel manifest, listed as Sterling's personal liaison officer with direct access to the base supply chain and financial disbursement authority. I traced my index finger slowly over his printed name, pressing hard enough to leave an indentation on the page. The corruption of my bloodline had officially crossed the line, infecting the institution I had bled to protect. I locked the heavy classified file into my floor safe, spun the combination dial, and sat back in my chair with my jaw clenching so hard I felt the pressure build behind my eyes. I was going to carve the rot out of my military, and it was going to be deeply, unavoidably personal. 2 weeks before the gala, I deployed to a rundown neon-lit motel 3 miles outside Fort Bradley's gates, checking in under a civilian alias with a prepaid credit card. The room smelled of industrial disinfectant and stale carpet. I did not care. I set up my surveillance equipment on the chipped laminate dresser and began 12-hour observation shifts in an unmarked sedan with heavily tinted windows parked across the drainage ditch from the base's commercial supply gates. I documented the illicit flow of unaccounted military hardware slipping out of the installation after midnight. Crates loaded onto unmarked trucks by soldiers working without proper authorization codes. Manifests signed with forged signatures I later matched to Roger's handwriting samples from his personnel file. One night, just past 11, I watched a supply sergeant exit the gate on foot, cross the gravel lot, and hand Roger a thick manila envelope through the driver's side window of his personal black SUV. Roger counted the contents under the dome light, grinned, stuffed the envelope into his glove box, and drove off toward the officer housing compound without looking back. I photographed every frame through a long-range lens, the shutter clicking softly in the dark cabin of my sedan. The systemic rot was deep, arrogant, and completely exposed to anyone willing to sit in the dark long enough to see it. They operated in broad daylight because they believed no one above them was watching. They were catastrophically wrong. The next morning, I breached the base's inner perimeter using a basic civilian contractor, past a laminated badge that got me through the main gate, with nothing more than a bored nod from the gate guard. I blended into the loud, chaotic background noise of a supply loading dock on the base's eastern edge, standing behind a stack of wooden pallets near the diesel pump station. That was the exact moment I saw her. Private First Class Chloe Bennett was struggling desperately to load heavy wooden munitions crates onto a flatbed truck, each crate outweighing her by at least 30 pounds. Her bruised hands trembled violently with each lift, her fingers barely able to grip the rough wooden slats. Standing over her, his face flushed red with uncontrolled rage, was my brother-in-law. Roger screamed inches from her face, the veins in his neck bulging brutally, attacking her intelligence and her worth, because the loading operation was running 30 seconds behind his arbitrary schedule. Spit flew from his lips with each word. Chloe swallowed her dignity whole, her terrified eyes dropping to stare at the cold, oil-stained concrete beneath her boots, too frightened to breathe a single word back to an officer who held her entire career in his hands. I stood motionless behind the pallets, watching. My grip tightened on the steel corner of the pallet until the sharp edge cut into my palm. Looking at Chloe's crushed spirit, I saw an exact agonizing reflection of my 15-year-old self. The girl sitting at the edge of that kitchen table, soaked in ice water, voiceless, being systematically destroyed by a narcissist drunk on power they never earned. The mission had just become something far deeper than an audit. That evening, I convened a secure off-the-books meeting with my elite JAG operatives, Lieutenant Samantha Collins and Lieutenant Kevin Brooks in the motel's dimly lit back room. Samantha Snorts was a former federal prosecutor with a jaw like a steel trap and zero tolerance for corruption. Kevin was a forensic accountant who could trace a single stolen dollar through 17 shell accounts. The air in the room hung thick with stale coffee and the sharp chemical tang of printer ink from the portable unit we had been running non-stop for 3 days. Spread across the cheap laminate table were the reconstructed fragments of 40 severely suppressed complaint files that Kevin had recovered from Fort Bradley's supposedly purged digital archive. We cross-referenced the shredded records against the original filing timestamps, tracking the unauthorized cancellation signatures straight back to Colonel Sterling's office on every single one. One complaint form in the pile stopped me cold. The handwriting was shaky. The letters pressed deep into the paper with the desperate force of someone who believed this was their last chance to be heard. The typed summary read, "I submitted these complaints over the past year, but they were always closed with no action taken." The signature at the bottom belonged to Private First Class Chloe Bennett. Samantha slammed a heavy fist onto the table, rattling the coffee mugs, visibly disgusted by the sheer volume of ignored cries from soldiers who had been mentally broken by Roger's reign. These were not bureaucratic colleagues sharing a government paycheck. We were a lethal unit bound by a sacred oath to protect those who wore the uniform. Samantha and Kevin looked at me across that table, not as a sister, not as a civilian failure, but as their undisputed commanding officer. I stood at the head of the table, issuing the final operational directive with the cold mechanical precision I reserved for missions that left no room for hesitation. The harsh fluorescent light from the bear's ceiling bulb cast deep shadows across the mountain of physical evidence that would end multiple careers and potentially send 3 people to federal prison. I ordered a complete unannounced tactical audit of the officers' gala, scheduled for the following evening. We would not fight them in the shadows. We would not send a polite letter requesting compliance. We would trap them inside their own lavish theater of arrogance, cutting off every avenue of escape, every back channel, every political connection. While the champagne was still flowing and the string quartet was still playing, I locked eyes with Samantha, then Kevin. I looked at Samantha, then Kevin. When the hammer falls tomorrow night, no rank, no bribe, and absolutely no family tie will halt the execution of justice. We are taking them down. I finalized the strike coordinates with General Vance's forward team through encrypted channels, confirming the 4-star arrival at exactly the moment I would signal from inside the gala. I triple-checked the communication protocols. Then I sat alone in that motel room after Samantha and Kevin left, staring at the water-stained ceiling, my jaw locked tight. I was going to burn my brother-in-law's empire to the ground, and I was going to do it in front of the sister, who spent her entire life convinced I was nothing. The invitation arrived the next morning, disguised as a condescending text message from my sister. The phone buzzed on the motel nightstand at 7 a.m. in the morning, its glow cutting through the dark curtains. She demanded I attend the Fort Bradley officers' gala that evening. She stated explicitly that I needed to see how real success looks up close. She attached a high-resolution photograph of her newly purchased $1,000 silk gown draped over an antique chair in her officer housing bedroom, the price tag still dangling from the sleeve. A blatant, calculated power play. My sister needed a loser standing nearby to feel like a winner. She thrived on contrasts the way a flame thrives on oxygen. I read the text in the dark motel room, my thumb hovering over the glowing screen, while Samantha organized the final classified evidence folders on the floor behind me. I did not block her number. I did not reply with anger or sarcasm. I typed a single word, coming, and I hit send. My sister had just willingly handed me the perfect insertion vector, a golden ticket, straight through the front gates of the fortress I was about to demolish. She had invited the executioner through her own front door, and she did it with a smiley face emoji attached to her reply. I spent that afternoon constructing my civilian disguise with surgical precision. I drove to a strip mall thrift store 6 miles from the base and pulled a shapeless, cheap gray suit from the clearance rack, price tag $4.50. The synthetic fabric was thin, slightly wrinkled, and smelled faintly of mothballs. I ensured it looked worn and utterly unimpressive. I tied my hair back with a fraying elastic band. I bypassed all cosmetics. I chose a pair of scuffed flat shoes with a tiny crack in the left heel. Every detail was a calculated weapon. Every loose thread on my collar, every faded stitch, every crease in the bargain bin fabric was a tactical choice designed to bait their arrogance and ensure they dropped their guard completely. I dressed in the motel bathroom and looked at my reflection under the buzzing yellow light. The woman staring back at me was not a major general who outranked every person who would be attending that gala. She was the perfect, pathetic victim my family had always wanted me to be. The disguise was flawless. I slipped my leather notebook into the inside jacket pocket, right next to my encrypted phone. 2 weapons, one for documentation, one for detonation. I checked the clock on the wall. 4 hours until the gala. 4 hours until the end of everything they built on lies and stolen dignity. The grand hall at Fort Bradley was suffocating from the moment I crossed the threshold. Crisp dress uniforms, glittering expensive jewelry, and the hollow, pretentious clinking of crystal champagne flutes filled every corner of the cavernous room. A string quartet on a raised platform played loud classical music that barely masked the boastful, self-congratulatory conversations of officers who had stopped earning their positions years ago. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vated ceiling, throwing fractured light across polished marble floors. I slipped through the main entrance, using my civilian contractor past 2 board gate guards, who barely glanced at my cheap gray suit before waving me through the metal detectors. Inside, I forced my posture to slouch, let my shoulders drop, made myself physically smaller, even though every muscle fiber in my body was coiled and ready. I positioned myself in the shadows near a massive marble pillar, pressing my back flat against the cold stone. My eyes scanned the room exactly the way they had been trained to scan hostile territory. I mapped every tactical exit within 4 seconds. I identified the key corrupt conspirators from my investigation files, matching faces to the names on Sterling's personnel manifest. Colonel Sterling stood near the bar with a glass of scotch, laughing too loudly at his own joke. And then I locked on to the unmistakable obnoxious laugh of my brother-in-law, echoing off the high-vated ceilings as he held court among a cluster of junior officers. Their champagne glasses raised in forced performative admiration. The collision was inevitable. Across the crowded room, my sister's heavily made-up eyes swept past a group of senior officers and locked directly onto my cheap gray suit like a heat-seeking missile acquiring a slow-moving target. Her fake high society smile vanished instantly, replaced by a terrifying mask of pure undiluted revulsion. I watched the transformation happen in real time, the practiced charm dropping from her face like a shattered mask hitting the floor. She shoved her half-empty crystal champagne glass aggressively into the chest of a passing waiter, nearly knocking the young enlisted man off balance, and marched furiously across the marble floor. Her expensive heels clicked against the stone in a rapid, aggressive cadence. Each step, a loaded weapon aimed directly at my position. The clicking grew louder, faster, more furious. She stopped inches from my face, her chest heaving, her nostrils flaring, her eyes narrowed into slits of concentrated rage. She was completely oblivious to the fact that she had just cornered a predator, not prey. She opened her mouth and the venom began to pour. My sister hissed through her teeth. Her voice kept artificially low to avoid drawing a scene, but every word was laced with concentrated, practiced cruelty. What the hell are you doing here, Betty? Do you think this is a charity soup kitchen? Do you have any idea how much you're embarrassing me right now? My brother-in-law materialized behind her like a bodyguard, summoned by a silent alarm, puffing his chest out in his pristine dress uniform, his toxic confidence suffocating the air between us. He tilted his chin down at me, his eyes full of undisguised contempt. Unbelievable. What the hell is the guard station doing, letting someone like you sneak in here? What are you looking for? Some scraps from the tables of successful people. The surrounding officers began to turn their heads, sensing the drama unfolding near the marble pillar. Some smirked openly, others whispered behind their champagne glasses. Roger stepped even closer, deliberately invading my personal space, the cold metal of the metals on his chest nearly touching my face. His breath smelled like expensive wine and cheap ambition. I did not flinch, I did not step backward. I did not lower my eyes or offer a single defensive word to soothe their bloated egos. I planted my feet on the marble floor spine, straight behind my cheap jacket, and maintained a freezing deadpan stare that cut right through Roger's polished metals and pressed uniform like they were made of paper. I am exactly where I need to be. I stated, my voice flat, stripped of any human warmth, any vibration of fear or submission. My unnatural composure acted like raw gasoline on an open flame. Roger's face reened from the jaw up. My sister sneered, her upper lip curling with deep revulsion as she looked my cheap suit, up and down slowly, deliberately, making absolutely certain the nearby officers heard every word that followed. A pathetic low-income clerk dares to show her face here. Look at you. It's pathetic. She turned slightly toward the watching crowd, feeding off their smirks like a performer working a hostile stage. A nameless major standing 3 feet away laughed loudly, eager to earn points with the captain's inner circle. He pointed a lazy finger at my stained gray lapel. The captain is right. She looks exactly like the janitorial staff. Colonel Sterling observed the entire spectacle from 10 feet away. His Scotch glass raised to his thin lips, smirking in open, approving silence before turning his back to continue his private conversation. He did not intervene. He did not care. He had built a kingdom where cruelty was currency, and this was just another transaction. Desperate to assert his dominance in front of the growing crowd of whispering officers, Roger violently snatched a champagne flute from the trembling silver tray of Private Chloe Bennett. His sudden grab spilled cold liquor across the private pressed uniform, darkening the green fabric in a spreading stain across her chest. She flinched. Nobody apologized to her. Nobody even noticed. Roger shoved the cold glass directly into my sternum with brutal theatrical force. Your rank is servant. Serve, smile, and carry that carefully. That is all a loser like you is good for. The rim of the glass pressed painfully against my breastbone. I wrapped both hands around the flute and held it with absolute stillness for exactly 5 seconds, controlling my pulse at 60 beats per minute through 4 counts of tactical breathing. During those 5 seconds, I memorized every single face in the room. Every smirk, every averted gaze, every coward who watched a fellow human being get publicly destroyed and chose to sip their champagne instead of speak a single word. I cataloged them all. Then I set the glass down on a cocktail with the slow, terrifying precision of a crime scene investigator, cataloging evidence at a murder scene. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out my worn leather notebook, and uncapped my tactical pen with a soft click that somehow echoed louder than the music. Roger lost his mind, his face contorted with disbelief, then fury veins bulging violently in his neck. His fists clenching at his sides until his knuckles turned white. He stepped forward until his hot wine-soaked breath hit my face in a nauseating wave. What the hell do you think you're doing? What are you writing down? I'll give you exactly 15 seconds to get out of those doors, or I'm calling security to drag you out. And believe me, they won't be gentle. He raised his right hand aggressively, folding his fingers back one by one. 15, 14, 13. My sister cheered him on from behind his shoulder, her face twisted in ugly victorious triumph. Did you hear him? Get out before you humiliate us any further? I continued writing. My pen did not stop moving across the page. Roger's countdown accelerated, his voice growing louder with each number, his shouts echoing across the now silent grand hall. The string quartet had stopped playing. Every officer in the room stood frozen, watching the spectacle unfold. 1098 Chloe Bennett stood pressed against the far wall, her empty silver tray clutched against her chest, her wide, terrified eyes locked on mine across the crowded room. I gave her a single imperceptible nod. A promise. Roger screamed, the final numbers spit flying from his lips, his face flushed nearly purple, his entire body trembling with rage and self-righteous power. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Before we witness the ultimate collapse of this corrupt empire, hit that like button to show your support for absolute justice. Have you ever had to stand completely silent while someone arrogantly dug their own grave? Tell me about it in the comments below. The exact second Roger screamed 1. The massive oak doors of the grand hall did not open. They were violently thrown wide, slamming against the interior walls with a force that shook the crystal chandeliers overhead and sent hairline cracks racing across the plaster molding. The heavy crash echoed brutally across the suddenly silent room, swallowing the last syllable of Roger's scream hole. It was not Bay Security coming to arrest a clerk. It was the synchronized razor-sharp stomping of combat boots against marble floor. 4 of the most decorated brigadier generals in the United States Army marched forward in full terrifying dress uniform, their rows of campaign medals and service ribbons gleaming under the chandelier light, like armor plating. They moved in a single unyielding diamond formation, their eyes fixed straight ahead like 4 guided missiles locked onto one target. The air in the room changed instantly. Panic rippled through the crowd in a visible wave, spreading outward from the doors, like a shock wave from a detonation. Officers who had been lounging with champagne glasses snapped to rigid attention, drinks forgotten. Colonel Sterling practically tripped over his own polished shoes, rushing forward with his hands outstretched in a pathetic servile display of forced hospitality, his scotch abandoned on the bar behind him. He stammered through a broken greeting. "Generals, welcome to Fort." His voice cracked and died in his throat. The 4 generals ghosted right past Sterling, as if he were a stain on the marble floor. They did not acknowledge his outstretched hand. They did not glance at his face. They marched in a direct, unyielding line through the dead, silent crowd of terrified officers, boots hitting the floor in perfect synchronized unison, the thundering cadence echoing off the weighted ceiling like the heartbeat of an approaching army. Junior officers scrambled out of their path. Champagne glasses were hastily set on any available surface. The generals stopped precisely 2 feet in front of the woman in the cheap gray suit, the pathetic clerk, the loser holding a leather notebook. In perfect bone-chilling unison, all 4 generals snapped to rigid attention, their chests thrust forward, their chins locked, and delivered a synchronized military salute that could have shattered glass. Major General Price, the base is ready for inspection. General Vance's voice hit the marble walls like a mortar around the words detonating across the frozen room. Every syllable was a grenade. Every head in the grand hall turned. The heavy crystal champagne flute slipped from my brother-in-law's paralyzed hand and exploded into 100 shards on the marble floor. The sound cracked through the silence like a final punctuation mark on his entire manufactured life. My sister's jaw unhinged. The blood drained violently from her face, pouring downward as if someone had pulled a plug, as she stared at the 4 most powerful generals in the room saluting her sister. The janitorial staff, the charity case, the pathetic clerk, the nobody. I returned the salute with razor-sharp precision, my arms snapping upward in a motion I had performed 10,000 times across 2 decades of service, permanently discarding the posture of a victim. I snapped my leather notebook shut, the sound cracking like a whip across the frozen room. Stepping right past my paralyzed, hyperventilating relatives without giving them a single glance. Without slowing my stride by a single step, I projected my command voice to the furthest corners of the grand hall, seizing absolute control of the installation. I am Major General Betty Price. Initiate a full lockdown of the base immediately. Cancel the gala. The inspection begins now. The crushing authority in my command sucked the remaining oxygen out of the room. Officers who had been laughing at my cheap suit 60 seconds earlier now stood at rigid attention, their faces drained of all color, their champagne-soaked confidence evaporating in real time. Heavily armed military police moved in from the service corridors and side entrances to secure every exit, their boots thundering against the marble, their weapons visible, effectively trapping the corrupt officers inside their own lavish celebration. My sister stumbled backward into a cocktail table, knocking over an entire row of crystal champagne glasses that shattered across the floor in a cascade of glass and foam. Roger stood absolutely motionless, his countdown hand still frozen in the air at number 1, his mouth hanging open, his entire manufactured identity collapsing in on itself, like a condemned building detonating from the foundation up. Minutes later, a massive conference room on the second floor had been completely transformed into an operational federal war room. Armed guards flanked the heavy double doors. I stood rigidly at the head of the heavy wooden conference table, flanked by Samantha and Kevin, who had arrived through the service entrance with the encrypted server's portable hard drives, and the complete evidence archive packed in reinforced steel cases. I shed the cheap gray suit jacket and threw it over the back of a chair. I would never wear it again. I aggressively rolled up the sleeves of my white shirt, exposing my forearms, the scars and calluses of 2 decades of service visible under the harsh fluorescent ceiling lights. The massive conference table was covered with stacks of forged financial ledgers, seized digital hard drives, and falsified incident reports that military police had just forcibly removed from Sterling's executive office. His desk drawers pried open with bolt cutters, his personal safe drilled through and emptied. I planted both hands flat on the table, feeling the cold wood grain beneath my palms, and looked at Samantha with lethal, unwavering focus. We are tearing this rotten system down. Kevin powered on the encrypted servers of fans humming to life. Samantha pulled the lid off the first sealed evidence box and began laying out the files in chronological order. The hunt had officially begun. As the night deepened and the entire base remained on total lockdown, the atmosphere inside the conference room was cold, clinical, and ruthlessly efficient. I called in the low-ranking soldiers one by one, bypassing every layer of their corrupt chain of command, under the crushing psychological weight of a federal inspector general inquiry. The polished facade of Fort Bradley cracked open like a rotten quail shell. Tearful, exhausted soldiers sat across from me in a metal chair under the unforgiving, fluorescent lights, and poured out years of systematic abuse. They detailed stolen credit for their work, severe emotional harassment, fabricated performance reviews designed to block promotions, and widespread embezzlement of supply funds orchestrated by my brother-in-law and explicitly shielded by Colonel Sterling's office. One supply sergeant broke down his head in his hands. Captain Castillo forced me to falsify 3 years of inventory. He said if I didn't, he'd ruin my pension. A young communications specialist wept across the table. Colonel Sterling personally logged into the system. I watched him delete the formal complaints with my own eyes. I sat perfectly still in my chair, absorbing the horrifying testimonies without showing a single flicker of emotion on my face. Inside, every word was another brick in the wall I was building around them. I was weaving the legal net tighter with every confession, turning their years of unchecked cruelty into the exact evidence that would bury them. Deep into the early morning hours, the heavy wooden door to the conference room creaked open. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes stepped inside, her posture rigid, interrupting a complex financial forensic review that Kevin was presenting on the encrypted monitor. Hayes stood at attention and delivered her report. "Ma'am, Private First Class Chloe Bennett is requesting to speak with the inspection team." I sat down my pen slowly. I nodded once, feeling a surge of profound, unspoken respect rise through my chest. The young woman, who had been shaking uncontrollably while holding a champagne tray hours earlier, who had flinched when Roger snatched that glass from her tray, was now voluntarily stepping into the crosshairs of a federal investigation. She was risking extreme retaliation from the very command structure she was about to expose. demonstrating the kind of raw, unflinching courage that my biological sister had never possessed a single grain of in her entire life. Chloe walked slowly into the interrogation room. She was visibly terrified, her breathing shallow, her fingers laced tightly together in front of her body, but her jaw was locked with a defiant, unbreakable resolve that I recognized immediately. It was the same expression I had worn at 15 when I decided I would never cry for them again. She bypassed all military pleasantries. She marched to the center of the room, pulled a thick, heavily worn, classified folder from inside her uniform jacket, and placed it directly onto the table. It landed with a heavy, decisive thud that echoed off the bare walls. Inside were the physical originals. The hard copies of 40 formal complaints filed against my brother-in-law over a span of 14 months. Each complaint bore Colonel Sterling's unauthorized cancellation signature, scrolled across the front page in thick red ink, each one a death sentence for the soldier who had dared to speak up. Chloe gripped the edge of the wooden table until her knuckles turned white, anchoring herself against the weight of what she was doing. I submitted these complaints over the past year, but they were always closed with no action taken. She stated, her voice cracking under the pressure, but refusing to shatter. Samantha covered her mouth with her hand. Kevin stopped typing. I stood up immediately, pushed back my chair, walked around the massive table, and stood directly in front of the young, exhausted soldier. I took the heavy file from the table with both hands, feeling the immense concentrated weight of her suffering pressing against my palms through the worn paper and smudged ink. 40 complaints, 40 cries for help. Each one systematically silenced, buried and erased by the men who swore an oath to protect the very soldiers they were destroying. I looked deep into Chloe's exhausted, red-rimmed eyes, and I intentionally dropped the intimidating, untouchable aura of the Inspector General. I spoke with absolute, unwavering sincerity, the same sincerity I had desperately needed to hear from a single adult at any point during my own destroyed childhood. Private Bennett, what you did tonight required extraordinary courage. This system crushed you, but you just saved it. Your bravery will go on the record. Chloe's chin trembled violently, but she held her salute until I returned it. I turned and locked the file securely into the steel evidence box, snapping the reinforced latch shut with a decisive click. I did not have theories anymore. I had the physical, irrefutable weapon required to execute final judgment. The killing blow had been permanently secured. As dawn crept into the room through the conference blinds, washing the walls in cold, pale gray light, the execution phase officially began. Sterling, Roger, and my sister were escorted into the interrogation room by armed military police guards in full tactical gear. The arrogance had been beaten out of all three of them by hours of isolated detention. Roger's pristine dress uniform was rumpled, his collar unbuttoned, dark circles carved under his bloodshot eyes. Sterling's silver hair was disheveled for the first time in his career. His tie loosened his posture, broken. My sister collapsed heavily into a metal chair, her silk gown now wrinkled and stained dark with nervous sweat under the arms and across the back. Her mascara had bled down her cheeks in black, jagged streaks. Her carefully constructed glamour was gone, stripped away like a costume after the final act. Seeing me sitting calmly behind the desk of absolute authority, flanked by my JAG officers, my sleeves rolled to my elbows, she burst into violent theatrical sobs. She reached her shaking hands across the wide table toward me, her fingers clawing desperately at the empty air. Betty, please, you can't do this to me. We're family. Spare us. I did not lean forward. I did not soften my gaze. I did not reach for her hands. I did not offer a single thread of warmth. I looked at her with the absolute cold detachment of a surgeon, cutting the last thread of dead tissue from a salvageable wound. I slid the heavy stack of signed confessions, forensic financial analyses, and Chloe's 40 irrefutable complaints directly across the table, letting the pages fan out in front of her trembling hands like a dealer spreading a losing hand across green felt. In this room, I am not your sister. I am the Inspector General of the Army. Your vanity blinded your humanity, and justice has no room for blind family ties. My voice did not waver, my hands did not tremble. My pulse held steady. Beside her, Roger stared blankly at the catastrophic pile of evidence, his chest heaving in rapid, shallow breaths, his lips moving without producing sound as the full crushing scope of his total destruction registered behind his glazed hollow eyes. His career, his pension, his freedom. All of it was gone, reduced to ink on a stack of signed confessions he could not take back. Colonel Sterling stepped forward from the corner where the guards had positioned him. His manicured hands trembled violently at his sides, the heavy gold glass ring on his right hand catching the fluorescent light. The powerful, untouchable man who had sneered at me from across the gala, who had watched my public humiliation with a Scotch glass raised in amused approval, was now a hollowed-out, broken shell, standing in wrinkled dress blues. The imminent reality of losing his lucrative military pension and facing federal prison time had turned his tanned, distinguished face the color of wet cement. "Mom, I have served for many years." He started, his voice cracking with pathetic, nauseating desperation, his eyes scanning my face for any fracture in the armor, any fissure of mercy he could exploit. I cut him off with a single flat sentence that ended his military career. "And you used those years to destroy the trust of the military, protecting a corrupt circle. Your failure is unforgivable." I held his gaze for 3 full seconds, watching the last dim spark of hope extinguish behind his eyes like a candle flame pinched between 2 fingers. Then I signaled the armed guards with a controlled flick of my wrist to permanently remove all 3 of them from my sight. The guards gripped their arms and marched them toward the door. My sister screamed my name one final time, her voice breaking against the concrete walls. I did not turn around. Weeks later, the fallout hit the Pentagon like a seismic event. I finalized a 55-page investigative report that systematically dismantled the entire command structure of Fort Bradley, documenting every fraudulent transaction, every suppressed complaint, every instance of abuse, with forensic prosecutorial precision. My brother-in-law was permanently stripped of his rank and dishonorably discharged, his military record branded with the permanent scarlet mark of corruption. He was cast into the civilian world in absolute public disgrace, his name published in the Department of Defense press release alongside the charges. My sister's was left with nothing. Her hollow, high society status evaporated overnight into a toxic cloud of legal debt, public scandal, and the deafening silence of former friends who suddenly did not return her calls. The designer bags, the diamond rings, the 1,000 silk gowns, all of it was seized or sold to cover legal fees. Colonel Sterling was immediately relieved of all duties and remanded to a federal court-martial on charges of widespread bribery, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to defraud the United States military. I sat alone in my quiet Pentagon office. The heavy oak door closed the room silent, except for the scratch of my pen against the final page of the punitive orders. Each stroke was an exorcism, a precise surgical extraction of every ghost that had haunted me since that kitchen table 25 years ago. I signed the last page, set the pen down on the polished desk, and exhaled for what felt like the first time in my entire adult life. Months after the purge, the heavy tires of my armored transport rolled smoothly through the reinforced gates of Fort Bradley. I stepped out into the crisp morning air, my boots striking the clean pavement with a sharp, confident sound. I was no longer the invisible woman hiding inside a $4 gray suit. I wore my ultimate armor, the 3 silver stars of a lieutenant general, gleaming on my shoulders, each one earned through blood discipline, sacrifice, and absolute uncompromising integrity. The promotion had been approved unanimously by the Joint Review Board 6 weeks after the investigation closed. The base personnel stood in pristine formation along the main road, uniforms, pressed postures, rigid, offering a genuine, deeply honorable welcome that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with earned respect. I walked past them with my chin level and my shoulders square. Nobody averted their eyes. Nobody flinched. The oppressive, toxic fog that had choked the life out of this installation for years had been completely burned away. I walked the expansive grounds alongside Colonel Evelyn Hughes, the fiercely incorruptible officer I had personally selected to replace the disgraced Sterling. Hughes was a 20-year combat veteran with 0 political connections and 0 tolerance for corruption. the exact opposite of the man she replaced. The atmosphere on the base had fundamentally transformed. Soldiers moved with clear, focused purpose, their heads held high, free from the constant fear of arbitrary punishment, stolen credit, and retaliation. The financial ledgers were completely transparent, subject to quarterly independent review. The chain of command operated cleanly by the book, with every complaint processed and investigated within 72 hours. Hughes briefed me on the new anonymous reporting system. She had implemented a direct pipeline that bypassed every layer of base command and landed on the Inspector General's desk untouched. No body would be silenced again. I had protected this house. I had taken a fortress of institutional abuse and rebuilt it from the barracks to the boardroom into a fortress of genuine earned honor. As we crossed the main quad, a newly promoted corporal stepped sharply forward from the ranks and delivered a crisp, textbook-perfect salute. It was Chloe Bennett. She stood with her spine straight as a rifle barrel, her uniform immaculate, her boots polished to a mirror shine, and a fierce, undeniable pride burning in her steady eyes. There was no trace of the terrified girl who had trembled while holding a champagne tray, who had flinched when Roger screamed in her face, who had gripped the edge of a wooden table until her knuckles turned white just to keep her body from shaking apart. She was still now. I returned her salute, and a subtle, genuine smile touched the corners of my mouth for the first time on this base. We had both walked through the same fire. We had both been crushed by a system designed to protect the powerful at the expense of the voiceless, and we had both forged ourselves into something unbreakable on the other side. She was the living proof that the system could be saved, and that the weakest voice in the room could become the one that brought the entire rotten structure down. I stood beneath the massive American flag, snapping hard in the wind, the heavy fabric cracking above my head like a drum beat. I took a deep, unrestricted breath. The air tasted clean. The profound wounds carved into me by my own blood would always leave thick, permanent scars across my memory. The ice water, the buried letter, the coffee-stained scholarship seal, the years of silence at that kitchen table. Those scars would never fully disappear. But they no longer controlled my pulse. They no longer dictated my posture, my voice, or the direction of my steps. True power resides in the absolute silence of justice. I understood that now with every cell in my body, not in arrogant screams at a gala, not in designer cut-owns or diamond rings purchased with stolen money, not in the desperate, pathetic manipulation of family loyalty weaponized against the people who loved too much and asked for too little. I turned on my heel and walked toward the command center, my boots striking the pavement in a steady, unhurried rhythm, my 3 silver stars catching the morning light. The flag cracked overhead. The base hummed with the quiet, disciplined energy of soldiers serving without fear. I did not look back. This story proves that the deepest wounds can forge the strongest armor. If you felt the absolute satisfaction of seeing justice served today, take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family to protect your own peace? Share your journey with me in the comments below.